Good morning. It has been a pleasure being here and getting to know some of you. I've known Jay since 2005. In the last 6 years, we've been teaching this course through Veritas Seminary. And for over 30 years for me, I've been researching Islam, writing about it. This is one of the books that I have. John of Damascus. This was my PhD dissertation turned into a book. I came over here to London School of Theology to do my PhD, and it was wonderful to get to know more of London. I always enjoyed coming over and being here. They've got a great place. What we do with the historical critique is really use the evidence to devastate the foundation of Islam. Because in some ways you have to get Muslims to look at what the truth is, what the facts show. And so you'll see that as we go through today and deal with this evidence, it's a very powerful way to reach Muslims, because they come to a point of realizing that they do not have the evidence to support what they believe. And they look for it, and we have it. So this is a very strong apologetic and polemic. You can use both. But what's good about it is that it is dealing with the mind, it's dealing with the soul, the spirit. And think of Nabil Qureshi, because this is what brought him to Christ. And that's what we want to do. Our whole purpose is to pull Muslims away from a false religion and introduce them to Jesus Christ and the true religion. So I have chosen to deal with John of Damascus. I spent 7 years on my PhD researching, and I continue to do that research and to write more books on that. So let's look at what John has to say to us about this whole matter. First of all, I want to delineate why he's important, what we can learn from him. In his major work, The Font of Knowledge, he provided a detailed critical analysis of what became Islamic doctrines. Those are the books that I dealt with in my PhD research. Due to the upbringing in the court of the Abd al-Malik, John was deeply familiar with what became Islam and with portions of what would become the Qur'an. Now, I'm using those what would become, because we do not believe that in his time, and he lived between, as we shall see, 675 and 750, he was right in the middle of the development of this religion that became Islam. So what can we learn from him? Number 3, John accused the Mahmed. We'll talk about who this Mahmed is. Not Muhammad, but Mahmed. He accused the Mahmed of being an Arian heretic. It's very important. We'll talk a little bit about Aries. Challenged the validity of his revelations, the Arian views, and criticized Islamic views on the crucifixion of Christ. So we'll pull all of this together. He referred to Muslims as Saracens, Ishmaelites, and Hagarenes, but he never referred to them as Muslims. And he should have, if he's living 70 to 80 to 90 years after the traditional Muhammad, in a place called Damascus, which was the center of what was going on at that time. Number 5, John's writings provided arguments that defined Christian polemics against what became Islam for centuries, setting the stage for more theological interactions. And then 6, John was simply the first apologist to the Muslims. Notice that I have the name Muslims in quotations because, as I said, it was not used at that time. Andrew Luth, who wrote a book on John called John Damascene early in the 2000s, said this: "If these works are indeed by John Damascene, they constitute the earliest explicit discussions of Islam by a Christian theologian." That's important because you want to have verification that John was where he was, and he was speaking about this early form of what became Islam. John of Damascus's short writings on Islam have indeed a very long history, as well as a profound influence upon other Christian writers who dealt with or wrote about Islam. One of those is Theodore Abul-Quda, who came later and carried his work forward, and then many in the centuries after continued that work. His exposition of Islam made Islam known to the Christian community and therefore made interfaith dialogue part of the history and the development of Islam as well as Christianity. This was written by Daniel Sahas. He wrote his dissertation on John of Damascus in 1972, and this was the book that led me to thinking about John of Damascus. And from that time, I have upgraded all that information that Daniel Sahas came up with his research. On the book of John of Damascus, this was the reason that I chose to spend 6 years researching the life and works of John of Damascus in relation to Islam for my PhD dissertation. I do have the book up here. I only have one copy, but these books are on Amazon and easy to purchase. And I hope you do get involved with John of Damascus, especially this book, because it goes right to the root of the problems that we find in saying that Islam came from an earlier time and a different story, the traditional. And we'll compare that later. I wanted to know what really happened during the early years of Islam. How did it develop? What was concrete? What was the historical critique, which deals with what manuscripts you would have, what archaeological discoveries, what about the coins, what about the inscriptions, what about the non-Muslim verified stories and comments at that time. We'll talk about that. This is a page from my translation. I translated his treatise called The Heresy of the Ishmaelites. So we're going to look at a little bit of that. And here he said at the beginning, there is also a coercive religion. He wrote in patristic Greek. And he used this word, coercive religion of the Ishmaelites, which prevails at this time and deceives the people, being the forerunner of the Antichrist. It originates from Ishmael, who was brought forth from Hagar under Abraham, and for this very reason they are called Hagarenes or Ishmaelites. So this is the core. It's a coercive religion. More than that, he says that there is a false prophet called Mahmed. Now we'll talk about this term. Why Mahmed, M-A-M-E-D? Well, if you look above, I've circled the Greek word, and you can pretty much make that out, M-A-M-E-D. It's not Muhammad. It's only 2 syllables, Mahmed. And I'll give you an explanation of that as we go through. But it's a false prophet called Mahmed, sprung up among them who, after conversing with an Arian monk, remember, Arians disputed that Jesus was the Son of God. He's a prophet, but he was a created being according to Arius. That's going to play into what we understand from John of Damascus. So an Arian monk concerning the Old and New Testament who fabricated his own heresy. So what he's saying is that this Mahmed, this leader who was involved in what became Islam, got his information from an Arian monk. Now, one thing I learned later after doing this translation is that I found that the word epanomazamenos in Greek up there, I originally translated it to be called Muhammad. Okay, you see that up there, a false prophet called Muhammad or Mahmed. Found out later with the what happens with languages at the time of this particular patristic word, it means so-called or nicknamed, not called. That wasn't his name. In other words, it points to the word Mahmed as a title. So it's not the name. It wasn't the name of a person. It was a title, and that title means chosen one or praised one. And we find that this word Mahmed was also used of Jesus Christ as the praised one, as the chosen one. In fact, there were a number of Mahmeds at that time, but not the traditional one that would go back to what the Muslims would believe.
We don't have the vowels here. It's just M-H-M-D, Mahmud. This is a title, not a person, though it's a title of people, applied to people. Let me repeat that. This is a title. Mel, back me up on this. Is this true?
It is. It is absolutely. It only became a name much later, centuries later.
Much later.
Once we have a prophet of Arabia in the mythology, then it becomes a name.
So hold on. What am I talking about? What are Mel and I talking about? There have been other problems that have come up in 2025. I did a talk back in July of this year that went viral, and unfortunately, because it went so big, I didn't introduce 2 new pieces of material. Now, since that time, there has been an enormous backlash against that video. Understandably so, because it is so big and it is so viral. And I understand why people have been wanting to really confront it and critique it. And there's things that we now have to reassess about what I've said in that video, especially the Mahmud argument. And the Mahmud argument, we're now going to put back on a back burner. We're going to put it on a back burner for now. And I'm going to let those who really are pushing the Mahmud argument, those who really are the ones who have done the work, the germinal work on that, I'm going to let them come forward and let them speak and let them push this argument.
So we'll deal more with that, Mahmed. As far as general background on John, who was he? Where did he live? He grew up in Damascus, the center of the whole Syrian Empire at that time, the area which was under Byzantine control. Damascus was a Christian city conquered by the Arabs in 635 AD. Notice I'm calling them Arabs. They were not Muslims at that time. And I'll explain who those Arabs were in a couple slides. By 661 AD, it became the center of the Umayyad Empire, 661 to 750. And we'll talk about this man named Abd-al-Malik. He is the key person, and John worked for Abd-al-Malik. John served in an important position under the leader of the believers. They were called believers, not Muslims, the Mu'mineen. His influence on later generations on Christians was significant. He came up with some very good apologetic arguments against Islam and the person that they later called Muhammad, and other leaders like Theodore Abakura used this argument. In fact, it was used very well for 300 years after. So what can we know about Islam through John's writings? He knew about Mahmed at the early stages of the movement that became Islam. We can gain a fairly accurate picture of the creation of Islam in the first 100 years from John's reflections and apologetic arguments. In fact, we find a more historically accurate understanding of what really happened because he was right there writing about it. He was an eyewitness, and a very good eyewitness. John was the last of the church fathers. He wrote a work, The Fountain of Knowledge, and he summarized 8 centuries of theology. It's a great book on its own. It's in 3 sections where he talked about the theology. The second section was dealing with the heresies. And he dealt with 100 heresies at that time. 97 of them he plagiarized from previous writers, but the last 3 were his own, and the 100th was the one that we're looking at, the heresy of the Ishmaelites. The year of John's birth is very important because it is tied to who he may have known and what he may have witnessed. Remember, he was there, and that's very important. Most scholars place John's birth in either 674 or 675 AD. The traditional date of his death is December 4th, 749 AD. I usually date him 675 to 750 just to make it easier. This was during the Umayyad years, and you see the first leader there, Muawiyah, 661 to 680. I'll be talking more about Muawiyah in my next session, which will be the last workshop, which will also be in this room, where I'm talking about the question, did Islam originate from anti-Christian leaders? And we'll talk about Muawiyah and Abdul Malik, especially there. Abdul Malik, you see, from 685 to 705. This is when John worked under Abdul Malik. His father, just as his grandfather was called a Logothetes, the chief tax collector of Damascus when it was captured in 635, but he survived. He stayed in his position because he knew the books. He knew how to deal with taxes. It was all in Byzantine Greek, and that was passed on to John's father. John's father probably died in 695, and then that's when John took over, working for Abdul Malik. John probably resigned his position and went off to the monastery at St. Sabas near Jerusalem between the years of 715 to 720. They were changing the whole monetary structure to Arabic control, and so he also found this a good time to retreat because it was getting kind of hot where he was. So that St. Sabas is near Jerusalem. It's still there, and that's mainly where he was to write all of the things that he wrote. And we have 1,600 pages of his work, and part of that was the heresy of the Ishmaelites and also his great theology. John's grandfather, Mansur bin Sarjun, was the financial governor of Damascus when the Arabs besieged the city. As I said, he surrendered the city after 6 months, saving the city from the Arabs. He retained the position as Logothetes, or chief financial officer, and passed it on to John's father and then on to John. Now, the Mansur family seems to have been, they were Syriac, seems to have been respected by both the Christians and the Arabs alike, and they were known for their piety and attachment to the Orthodox faith. That's Daniel Sahas, who did his research in this area as well. And there are stories of Abdul Malik and John's father meeting at their homes, and so they were good friends. They were respected, even though they had different religious perspectives. John of Damascus is important for us today because he stood on the cusp of a new world order that would soon determine the destinies of most of the countries throughout the Middle East, as we know today. He was simply a Christian in dialogue with what became Islam. So you see those quote marks. Islam was not around yet. It was forming. J.W. Sweetman, a theologian, even goes so far as to say that perhaps no individual Christian thinker is so important in a comparative study of Islamic and Christian theology as John of Damascus. I agree with him wholeheartedly. John has become more and more central in what we're doing, especially with the historical critique. So I'm glad that the Lord led me to John of Damascus. John was, first of all, a Christian theologian who represented the best of the theology from the previous 6 centuries. He summarized it. Secondly, John's high position in the Arab-dominated government gave him unprecedented access to the leaders of the Arabic world. He knew al-Hajjaj, who will come up later as we talk about the formation of the Qur'an. Now, as far as the authenticity of the heresy of the Ishmaelites, some want to say, oh, John didn't write that. That doesn't sound like him. It was written in the next century. Well, I spent those 6 to 7 years researching, going through, and looking at all the earliest manuscripts and found that there's an 8th century, late 8th century, which is when he wrote. We're thinking he wrote it about 730. And so we have a very early copy of this heresy of the Ishmaelites. And he also said in his original plan of his final work with the 3 sections that there would be a section on the heresy, and this was the 100th. If John's heresy of the Ishmaelites was not written by John and was perhaps from a later period, then we would not be able to make any definitive statement from the writings about the nature of the Muslim belief system in the first half of the 8th century, or indeed the first 100 years after the traditionally held death of Muhammad in the year 632 AD. So it's very important for me to verify that he did write this at the time that it was said to have been written. And then Robert Hoyland, who is very much involved in dealing with these documents, said this: if the chapter on Islam is genuinely by John of Damascus, it represents the earliest Greek polemical writing against Islam. And just to refresh you, you already know, polemics, verbal attack against or refute what others say. And apologetics would be more of the defense of Christianity, but dialogue with the other side. So it also goes back and forth between apologetics and polemics. Now, what about this term Muhammad, again in quote marks? John calls him Mahmed. He's the founder of a false religion. Sorry, no picture available. There's some taboo about that. But John calls him a false prophet. Now, and he apparently learned his heresy from an Arian monk. A later tradition is apparently a Nestorian monk, Bahira, with a name. Okay, here Muhammad has I think a face covering on. But anyway, John does not know about the later tradition of Bahira. So from that, we take that this Nestorian monk that would have come to John is a later fabrication. I would take the Arian-like monk first because it fits with what John understood. Muhammad claims that the book was sent down from heaven, the traditional Muhammad. So whenever I say Muhammad in this talk, I'm referring to the Muslim view of Muhammad. So back to Mahmed. The mother was Mary, the sister of Moses. He knew. What did he know? What did John know about this religion that was developing in the time of Abd-al-Malik? He knew he saw it written. The mother was Mary, the sister of Moses. So there's that mistake of Miriam, the sister of Moses. Jesus, without human father, was born a prophet. He knew the Jews wanted to crucify him, but they only crucified his shadow, so he was familiar with those words, that idea, that Jesus was taken to heaven by God. I'm going to expand on this and show you the actual words of these testimonies. He knew that in heaven, Jesus denies telling people that he was the Son of God and God. Now picture this. This is by 730 AD. And this is what a learned academic Christian knew who was right there in the middle of all of these ideas percolating. And this understanding shows that he truly had knowledge of the content of what soon became the Qur'an, or at least part of it, in 730 AD. So he wrote between 730 to 743 AD, this particular treatise. The Quran and the surahs used, he refers to primarily four what we would now call Medinan surahs or later surahs. And my question there, was the Quran finished? Because this is all he knew. Very little of it, too. He referred to Surah 4, the women, Al-Nisa. He referred to some things in Surah 5, the table, Al-Ma'idah. Surah 2, the Heifer, the longest one, Al-Baqarah. So he has some phrases from these. So it's percolating around where he is now in Damascus. But he also has another surah called the She-Camel. It's 1/6 of his whole treatise. He goes on and on about this she-camel drinking up rivers and getting killed and going to paradise and drinking up the rivers there and everything. And there are only just 7 phrases now in the Quran. There's no book of the she-camel, but some of the she-camel survived to get into the Quran, but just certain allusions. It's humorous in a sense. Okay, as far as practices, this is interesting because he knew these things were happening to these people who were becoming Muslims. They called themselves something else at that time, and I'll tell you what. But circumcision of men and women, orders not to observe the Sabbath, okay, because that was the Jewish day. Orders not to be baptized, because that was a Christian thing. Orders not to eat certain forbidden food, so they had their beginnings of halal traditions. Orders not to drink wine, so that was even there in the early time that John was familiar with. As far as his critique of the Muhammad's teaching or the leader's teaching, he said this. John's first objection is that Christians are called associators by the Ishmaelites for ascribing a partner or son to God. So that word associators is very important. John, in turn, called the Ishmaelites mutilators for tearing apart the Trinity, for he reasons that if God's word and spirit are taken away from him, then he is less than God, because the Quran does talk about Jesus being the word and the spirit, and John really clamps onto that understanding and makes a very good apologetic argument from that was used for over 300 years by followers of John. John states that the Word of God and the Spirit must have always existed, because otherwise God would not have his Word or his Spirit. The Quran does talk about the Word and the Spirit. The Ishmaelites believed that the Word of God represented by the Quran was uncreated. And that's where John took this idea and really made it critique what the Ishmaelites were trying to say, and just say that John was, or Jesus was a created being. Well, how could he be if Allah did not have his word and spirit from the beginning, and it was in the created being Jesus? Then could he say anything? He didn't have his word, and he didn't have his spirit. That came later. And so this was the argument that John was using. So John reminds them that even their own scripture state that the prophet Jesus was called the Word of God. And then John then explains that the uncreated Word of God is the eternal Logos, or Christ. So he's able to bring that into the argument. And then this is what he says. If the Word is in God, it is obvious that he is God as well. How could he not be if he had the eternal Word in him? And then what became the Qur'an was saying at that time that the Spirit of God and the Word of God was in Jesus. This argument became one of the most popular ones developed by John and was used for centuries as Christians confronted Muslims in the defense of the Trinity. And perhaps the reason for the success of John's argument is that it is based on his foundational theological explanations of the nature and roles of the three persons of the Trinity in his Orthodox faith, where John takes great care to show that it was necessary that the Word had always existed in the Godhead. Quote, "For there never was a time when God, the Word, was not." I really encourage you to read more of John of Damascus's actual theology. He's brilliant, and he gives you a very good summary of all that went on in the previous centuries leading up to his time. And he was the last of the church fathers. And this argument made a lot of sense, even to his adversaries. Also, unlike human speech, which dissipates in the air, the Word of God is always subsistent, always existing in him. John makes it clear that the Word could not be outside of God, but since the Word is always begotten of the Father, he must be always existing, living, perfect, distinctly subsistent, and having all things that his begetter has. Use this argument with your Muslim friends that John comes up with. It's brilliant. And as I said, it was used by the chief apologists and polemicists for 300 years after John against Islam. His second objection is that Christians are said to be idolaters because they venerate the cross. So John inquires how the Ishmaelites may escape the charge of idolatry since they, quote, kiss and embrace the Kaaba. So he knew about the Kaaba. But when we understand that there were many Kaabas, there was a Kaaba in Petra, which was nearby. And he may have been referring to that particular Kaaba. And he was aware of the story of Abraham taking Ishmael. Well, right, not Ishmael, Isaac, to sacrifice him. And then also the denial of the Trinity as it was taking place. The first, and I wanted to show you just a few comparisons of what John said and what the Qur'an said, and how it shows that John was familiar. So here is from the heresy of the Ishmaelites. Quote, he, parentheses, Mahmed, says that there is one God, creator of all things, who has neither been begotten nor has begotten. So that's John from his own theology. And then in the Quran, we have this in Surah 112, 1 and 3. Say he is Allah, the one and only, he begetteth not, nor is he begotten. So it shows that John was aware of some of these arguments from what he was calling the heresy of the Ishmaelites. He was not calling it a book yet. In fact, he talked about these 4 different surahs as separate books, separate writings. He did not talk about one book the Qur'an. He didn't use the word Qur'an. So he was still looking at what was developing into what became the Qur'an. And that's very important to know, that right there in that marker, that time of the turn of the century, the Qur'an was not finished yet. In fact, it had a long way to go. The denial of the deity of Christ. This is what John said in the Heresy of the Ishmaelites. When Christ ascended into heaven, according to what he's picking up from this document, the Heresy of the Ishmaelites. When Christ ascended into heaven, God questioned him, saying, "Oh, Jesus, did you say, I am the Son of God and God?" And Jesus answered, saying, "Be merciful to me, Lord. You know that I did not say that." So we know that this is in the Quran now. John is aware of this particular idea. In what does the Quran say? Surah 5:116, and behold, Allah will say, "O Jesus," you'll see some differences here. "O Jesus, the son of Mary, didst thou say unto men, worship me and my mother as gods of derogation of Allah? He will say, glory to thee, never could I say what I had no right to say." So John's view of it is an earlier form. So again, it's being written. He's getting all these different fragments called writings. Well, in a sense, nothing has changed in the 1400 years. There is still that denial of Jesus. And as I said, in the next workshop that I do, the last workshop up here, it will deal more with this idea of anti-Trinitarian Christianity being perhaps working its way in to the formation of what became Islam and the Quran. John referred to the Ishmaelite beliefs as a heresy of Christianity because they denied these two major doctrines, much like the Arians in the time of the Nicene Creed. He called Mahmed a false prophet and said that Mahmed learned his false views regarding Christ from an Arian priest. So just a summary right now. He also called the Ishmaelites mutilators because they tore apart the Trinity by believing that God's Spirit and His Word were created afterward. So now let's go on to a little bit more. What does John know about Islam? He demonstrates a fairly accurate knowledge of the religion and the founder, but he's calling him Mahmed. And remember, Mahmed at this time is a title. It's a nickname. It's not a name, a personal name. And Mahmed meant chosen one, praised one.
There's things that we now have to reassess about what I've said in that video, especially the Mahmed argument. And the Mahmed argument, we're now going to put back on a back burner. We're going to put it on a back burner for now. And I'm going to let those who really are pushing the Mahmed argument, those who really are the ones who have done the work, the germinal work on that, I'm going to let them come forward and let them speak and let them push this argument.
And there were a number of Mahmeds. Jesus also being called a Mahmed, praised one, chosen one. He is aware of the main doctrine of the religion, especially in regard to Christ. He knows some of the surahs available at that time and a number of traditions and practices that he is not aware of would be the Nestorian monk that came later. This was a later rendition when those who were from the Nestorian background probably wanted to get their view in, and their monk named Bahira. And in Islamic studies from those early manuscripts, the more detail that you have usually shows that it is a later rendition and these other details are added. He has misunderstandings on some things that should have been known by a scholar in those times. He worked under Malik. He was there in the court of the caliph. I feel like he should have known more things, but especially one living in the presence of the caliph, he should have been more aware. It is likely that he did not have access to large portions of the Qur'an because it simply had not been completed or canonized yet. And again, in the workshop that I do later, I will give a lot of evidence about this particular idea that the Quran was still being written, and I'll give you evidence for that. We always want to go back to the evidence, the historical evidence. So the summary on this part: Islam was not fully formed by the time of the death of Muhammad in 632, but was in part a reaction to the success of the Arab conquest of the Middle East in the 630s and 640s. This quote that I'm reading is from Andrew Luth and his ideas of what happened. It goes on, from a movement inspired by apocalyptic Judaism, emerging Islam distinguished and separated itself from Judaism and found its identity in the revelations made to Muhammad, or who became Muhammad. It was an apocalyptic time, and I'll again give you a better understanding of that in the next session I do this afternoon. But that was the big driver of so many things that developed not only in the Quran, but also in the practices. The development of the religion took some decades, and only towards the end of the 7th century did something recognizable as Islam emerge. John's account, if written about the turn of the century, would fit such a picture. Andrew Luth goes on, the clear sense of Islam as a pseudo-prophetic religion, focusing on the unity and transcendence of God, John's understanding of Islam as finding its identity in Ishmael as opposed to Isaac, his rather fluid awareness of the scriptural status of the revelations made to Muhammad, awareness of written traditions, most but not all of which were soon to find their place in the book, the Quran. All this fits such a picture. But here is not the place to pursue this topic any further, and he drops it. But I took it upon myself to go on from where Andrew Luth left off. So the challenge is this. While Andrew Luth concludes, but there is not the place to pursue this topic any further, this is where present research needs to pick up the pursuit. So let's look at a little bit more evidence, now finish up with these few slides, that support my view that Islam started out as a heresy of Christianity, and I have a fuller presentation later this afternoon. So just some evidence of the 8th century Quran, and I rely a lot on Stephen Shoemaker because he says such good, brilliant things. So when was the Quran completed? The standard Islamic narrative states that the Quran was written down within 20 years of Muhammad's death, so by 650. And that was dealt with brilliantly in a previous session. However, there is strong evidence that demonstrates that the Quran was not completed until well into the 8th century. So Dan Brubaker in his work with manuscripts is also showing that verification. But looking at Stephen Shoemaker, and this is a very good book, Creating the Quran. In his book, Creating the Quran, he provides a provocative evidence that the Quran is not a 7th century document. he writes this: on the basis of the available historical evidence, we conclude that the Quran's final composition into the canonical form that has come down to us today seems to have taken place around the turn of the 8th century under the direction of the Caliph Abd al-Malik, 685 to 705, and his viceroy al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. This is where we want to try to validate, could this have been the possibility? There are a lot of people writing books, and they're zeroing in on this same understanding. Chase Robinson, for example, concurs. There is, in fact, a substantial body of evidence from both inside and outside the Islamic tradition identifying Abd al-Malik as the one who, with the assistance of al-Hajjaj, standardized the Quran in the unvarying form that has come down to us today. So we have actual written documents that state this information between Abd al-Malik and al-Hajjaj. And in further presentations, I can show that, but not this weekend. Shoemaker realizes that John of Damascus, who worked as a chief tax collector under Abd al-Malik, documented some of the evidence that supports Shoemaker's assertions in his treatise of the heresy of the Ishmaelites. Shoemaker goes on, in a section of the treatise dedicated to cataloging various religious errors, John includes Muhammad's or Mahmed's followers. He's always going to refer to him as Muhammad. But he doesn't necessarily believe that there was the Muhammad at that early time. But anyway, Muhammad's followers, whom he considers to be little more than another variety of Christian heresy, naming them the Ishmaelites. Islam was still a work in progress that was trying to find its way among the various monotheisms of the late ancient Near East, and John's account provides a precious witness to how this process was still unfolding in his day before his own eyes. And I agree, John is pinnacle to understanding what occurred in this formation of what became Islam. Indeed, it is likely that John would have been better informed than most Muslims regarding the affairs of the caliphate. He was there. He worked for Abd al-Malik, including any official doctrines or scriptures as they were attempting to propagate. That material was being written at that time, and John was right in the middle of it. In any case, John would have known well what was going on inside the caliphate at this time, and it surely stands as no mere coincidence that he identifies significant portions of the Quran as separate writings. Remember, he did not call it one book, but he used the Greek word writings as they were separate writings. They were not put together yet. And it surely stands as no mere coincidence that he identifies significant portions of the Quran as separate writings, seeming to confirm the conditions implied by al-Hajjaj's speech. Al-Hajjaj spoke about this. We do have that particular document, and he's talking about what he's doing with the development of manuscripts. Clearly, we must conclude the sacred Ishmaelite writings that John knew in this era and describes in his account of their beliefs cannot have been the Quran as we know in its present form. That is very, very important. On this basis alone, it seems highly unlikely that the Quran as we know it, as we now have it, had been completely fixed by the turn of the 8th century, when John, who again was extremely well-informed and well-connected, I agree with that, wrote his description of the writings that Muhammad's or Mahmed's followers ascribed to him and revered as sacred scripture. So again, he's talking about the development, not the completion. So the conclusion. For many Christians at that time, like John of Damascus, this new religion was understood as just a heresy of Christianity with anti-Trinitarian beliefs and a false prophet. That's from my book on John of Damascus. And I wanted to mention that, again, it's on Amazon. And also, I wrote another book, The Guide to Answering Islam, which I use in a lot of classes. It's also written for the church. And it's everything that a Christian needs to know about Islam and reaching out to Muslims, because every chapter has a section. There's four big sections: the history, the development of the history, and all these things that you would find in John of Damascus, and the development of the scriptures that became the Qur'an. But then I go into a section of beliefs and practices, and then a section on the controversies, especially crusades versus jihad and so on. And the fourth section is all on apologetics. How do you reach out to Muslims? And each chapter has something on how to reach out with love and truth. Because it's important to love them, but if you don't tell them the truth, you're not going to necessarily be able to engage. And we say with that truth, the historical critique is one of the best ways, because you have a relationship with them and you bring up these questions. What about this? Was there a Muhammad in the time of the early 7th century and so on? So, if you're interested in knowing a little bit more of what Jay and I are developing in a bigger book called The Man, the Book, and the Place, I've just had a book, Creating Islam, published by a campus group called Ratio Christi, and it deals with the Man in the Book and the Place, as well as my ideas about how Islam was created. And the easiest way to get it is through PDF. It's $3. There you have the website, or you just go to ratiochristi.org, look for the press, and it's listed on the first page. And they'll send you a PDF right away. But that'll give you an idea of where we're going. But at this point, are there any questions? Okay. Anybody going to? Okay.
My question is, on your slide on the denial of the divinity of Christ, in the version that John of Damascus reports, it seems closer to Christian beliefs than what ends up in the later version in the Qur'an. So my question is, after Muslims presumably have had more interactions with Christians, why are they claiming that Christians are saying you should worship Mary?
Why Christians should worship Mary, or why is it in the Quran?
Why is the Quranic version, which is presumably later, further away from what Christians actually believe?
What, in regard to Mary? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so I could understand if Muhammad was hearing bits and bobs because he was an illiterate merchant, that he would include these misconceptions about what Christians believe. But if the earlier version is that just Jesus is saying that he should be worshipped, why would the later version of the text include Mary in that?
Well, remember, he's just familiar with certain fragmentary parts of the Quran. It was being written at that time, and changed throughout that time, because we believe that Al-Hajjaj was the one who was pulling these manuscripts from all over, a lot of it from Syriac Christian liturgy, and as it was being translated into Arabic at that time, because now they could write it down, they were also pulling in these false ideas, and for the when they put Mary into the so-called Trinity, that came later. That was not something that John mentioned or knew about. He knew that there was a mistake about Mary being Miriam, but there were a lot of things he was not aware of. So I take that to mean that it was still being written, but he would have known Al-Hajjaj. He certainly knew Abd-al-Malik. He was right in the middle. So in 730, it gives an indication that a lot of the Quran was still being processed. That's what we need to focus on there. And yes, it kept being changed as they developed it.
Do we know who John obtained the surahs from?
Right there in the Caliphate, that's where Al-Hajjaj had his people pulling these in. And I'll even be mentioning this more in the other session. He would have had people pulling in, and we would think that even some of these so-called manuscripts, early manuscripts, may have been around even before the time of the traditional Muhammad, that there was a collection. Al-Hajjaj was collecting all this material, all these stories, many of them from Greek myth and incomplete Old Testament stories, because they needed a book. This was a time that Abd-al-Malik realized that it may be the end time. And that's what I'll do. I'll show you a lot in this other session that I do, that because they thought it was coming to the time of the apocalypse, they were trying to make their own religion, which would be based on Christianity to an extent, but denying Jesus as God himself, so that's the anti-Trinitarian part, and they needed a book. They needed a man, a book, and a place. And that's how Mecca came into the whole scene. But that was more in the 8th century. So there's a development. John was at the beginning point of that. Okay, another question?
Daniel, thank you for giving us so much intel. My question is regarding calling Islam the heresy of the Ishmaelites. From what I know, Ibn Abbas, Ibn Kathir, their genealogies are not complete. There's no relation going all the way back to Ishmael that was completely put together. I mean, even Ibn Ishaq in his Siras al-Rasulullah is not able to compile that completely. Why does John take that presumption that it is from, in fact, Ishmael himself? Was there like a written down reason? Like, I don't know if my question makes sense.
Well, the Arabs up in that area that were allies to the Byzantines and the Persians, the Sassanids, they were both Christian groups. They had come up from Yemen in the 2nd and 3rd century. They had built their kingdoms. You had the Ghassanid kingdom, which was more in Syria and Jordan, and they allied with the Byzantines. They were monophysite in their religion, monophysite Christians. The Lakhmids were another group from Yemen, also immigrating from the 2nd and 3rd century, and they allied with the Persians. And really a lot of the fighting that took place was because between these Arab tribes that were very good warriors. They were basically had their kingdoms. They had been in place for centuries. And so the Lakhmids from the Persians were fighting against the Ghassanids, and the Lakhmids were Nestorian. So Nestorians who were considered somewhat heretical by the Orthodox, and the nothing's changed. The Ghassanids were considered monophysites, which is similar to what you have in the Coptic Christians today. But that was all ironed out later and balanced. But that was what was going on. And so what you see in the development, not only of the scriptures, but of this religion that became Islam, it came out of this milieu of Christianity and an anti-Trinitarian type of Christianity. But it was a mess. But because the Byzantines finally won the big war, and they moved up to collect themselves, they gave the land over to the Arabs that were there. They had their own kingdom. They took over the control of the taxes. And from that milieu, Islam developed. They now had the power. They had the resources. They were minting their coins. And again, in my other session, I will show you the evidence from the coins.
When we go to Muslims with this criticism, the thing is they come back to us with criticism we have in our scriptures ourselves, with especially mentioning portions that was added later. So you have early original writings that some versions was later added. So how do we respond to that when they come with that criticism to us?
Well, one, we don't make the claim that that the Muslims make, that their Quran was eternal and there should not be any changes. And yet, even in this conference, we have seen that there were many changes all through. And for John, understanding what John was looking at, he was also giving a time marker on these documents that were changing. I mean, the surah of the camel, the she camel, is not there. It was there in these writings at that time. And we find that, well, if you understand that Al-Hajjaj may have been the one to take all of these different stories, some that were written hundreds of years later and pulled in, probably written in Syriac, and then transliterated into the Arabic that was being formed, because at that early time, they didn't have the diacritical marks. They had 16 consonants, and that's why they had to develop the diacritical marks, and then you get all the different versions of the Quran. The basic thing is that it was in flux. If you compare it to our New Testament, we have so much evidence. I mean, we have 25,000 documents from early times of over almost 6,000 Greek manuscripts. Yes, there were some words that were put in, and we know where they were, but we have so much evidence, overwhelming evidence, that the critique against Christianity is just gives us the time and the ability to show how strong our documents are, how strong our beliefs are. Islam can't do that. And that's where the historical critique is so valuable, because it tears down that foundation, and they realize that all they have are fraudulent documents, fraudulent stories, stories that were made up hundreds of years later that never happened. And when they find that out, they leave. They realize Islam is a sham. And that's the beginning part. Of course, we need to then bring them to the truth. And that's what we want to do. Yes.
Thanks, Daniel. Two quick questions. The Creating Islam book, when you try to buy that, even for the PDF from outside the US, it says you can't do it. So it seemed weird to me too, but maybe you could look into that. And then secondly, you said that there is this debate about whether John of Damascus really wrote the works attributed to him. How strongly do you think we can say that he did actually write them?
Excellent. Yeah, there's some criticism. Oh, John didn't write that. But in my research, I was able to show that in his actual work that we have, the real deep theology, the fountain of knowledge, that these arguments are in there. They're very much John's ideas about the Word and the Spirit and all those other things. But the other thing is that we have, he wrote this around between 730 to 740. We have 8th century documents that have this written down. So we can trace it back. You may not have the original writing, but you have a copy of it that is very, very close to the time. Okay, so that's significant. Because others are saying, oh, this was written in the 9th century by Abokura or something else. But no, it fits John's whole vocabulary and idea, even though it's on a simpler level. Okay?
Okay. Last question.
Thank you, Daniel, for your lecture. I have a question divided in two sections. The first one is, if the general understanding at the time was that Islam was a Christian heresy derived from Arianism, then are there any contemporary historical sources that we can refer to in order to support this view? And second, when did the church switch from viewing Islam as a heresy, such as the Mormons or the Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, to viewing them as a legitimate religion? And what influenced this so that the church no longer holds this view in its majority?
I'm standing here and it was just very... Shall I repeat that? Yeah, but not with the microphone, just tell me.
The first question is, do we have any other sources that we can refer to contemporary to John to say that this was how Christianity viewed Islam as a heresy?
Okay.
And also, the bigger question is, why and at what point and what influenced the church to switch the view from calling them a heresy, like we still call the Mormons or the Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, to saying it's a legitimate religion?
Okay. The first question, thank you. The first question is, what other sources would he have been dealing with besides his eyewitness sources? There are those, like I mentioned, documents talking about Al-Hajjaj putting together the book. And so there are the written documents. I probably should make a list of those. But we do have them. And then as far as the second question, and what was that? Okay. Jay's reminding me that you have Thomas the Presbyter, Sabaeus. You have those coming from an earlier position, in the late 7th century. So John would have been familiar with those documents from other Christians, from other observers. So that's a good one.
So the other question is, when did we stop calling them a heresy?
Okay.
I guess at some point the church must have switched.
So when was it not called a heresy? Some were calling it a heresy continually, but when the Arabs, Abd al-Malik was a powerful leader. He had a different idea of a new religion, an Arab religion. So he was pushing that. So even in the time of Abd al-Malik, and shortly after that with his sons and nephews becoming the next caliphs up until 750, they would have been pushing this idea. It was really, I think, with the Abbasids after they took over in 750 that you have this formation of what became Islam. So I would say under the Abbasids, because they wiped out all the literature from the Umayyads, and and that's something that we need to understand. As different groups came in, they pretty much either hated the group that they conquered, and the Abbasids hated the Umayyads. They destroyed most of the literature that they wrote. So it's good to have something from John of Damascus who was there and safe in St. Sabas, in the monastery and so on, writing in Greek, which they did not read at that time. So a lot of the Umayyad writings were wiped out, so we have from the Abbasids more of the strictness, and they had the control. So the big thing is the historical critique has so much information. You can do it neutrally with your friends. You don't have to argue. You're bringing up questions. You're supplying answers. And it makes them think. Just like the Germans use the historical critique on Christianity, and that's why we had a lot of empty churches, and now we're regaining from that because we realize Christianity has the answers. We have the documents. We have the verification. We have the truth. Islam cannot do that because it does not have the documents. It does not have the right manuscripts. It is fraudulent, and we are showing that. And when Muslims realize that, they turn away from Islam. And that's what we want them to do.
All right.